Can we start off just by getting a little bit of sense of who you are, your background, your school?
I teach in South London and I'm a secondary school English teacher. I've been teaching for over 12 years. My own heritage is that, I'd first introduce myself as a 100% Londoner. My parents were Bengali immigrants who came here in the 1970s,
Right.
and I teach in a very diverse part of London, and I teach curriculum English, and I teach a great bunch of children.
What's the background of your school?
Yeah, so I think most teachers and students who leave my school always describe St Martin in the Fields High School for Girls as there's no other place like it. So we're a very modern school. We're in South London in Tulse Hill, which is just a stone throw away from Brixton. But our school was actually first the concept of our school goes back to 1699, and people might be familiar with St Martin in the Fields, the church in Trafalgar Square. So fast forward from 1699 to the 1960s and 70s. So, the demographics of South London and Brixton, it was where the first generation of the Windrush, the migrants had settled. That was a central place in terms of housing, work. So, the Windrush generation came with their children. They were the children of the Windrush. So the schools around the areas were also the first schools for the Windrush generation, and our school was provided an education for the daughters of the Windrush generation.
I see. I see. So, as a school in the current context, most of your girls are black and have the lineage, if you like, the heritage from Windrush. Is that right?
Yes, so there would be. It's a very diverse school, but it's a high proportion of girls who would identify themselves as a black girl.
Yeah.
But obviously within that, there's a huge amount of there's been changes, so a huge amount of diversity in terms of Black Caribbean and today Black African. So if we think about when the children of the Windrush came to the UK and to London, and we think of today and the perceptions we have of black culture and some of the stereotypes of Brixton. This goes back to the facility, the education that was provided, and looking back, and it's very much in the research that the UK and the government they were not adequately prepared to embrace these children to come here to study here.
Sure, sure.
And I think there's a lot of it's still very reflective today. We have a lot of amazing young people who come from different parts of the world, who come to school to London today. And I always think about my children. I have a young girl who's come from Quito in Ecuador. Last week she would have been there in a warmer climate, and less than a week later she's wearing a traditional school uniform, and she's in a completely different setting. Now, if we think about the generation of the Windrush and when they arrived, it was a culture shock for them. And imagine being a young child and coming to a different school environment, and there just wasn't the resources and planning in place for them.
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
The literature is quite shocking when we look back, and in the 60s and 70s, a lot of black children were, they were just sort of funneled to buses to special schools, and they were actually called. A derogative term was used to describe these children, that they were educationally subnormal. I mean, I feel horrified to use
I'm
this
not
word.
laughing because it's funny. I'm laughing because it's shocking.
Yeah, it's shocking,
Actually,
isn't it?
this is stuff that
It's
I don't really know.
actually shocking, and this is in the literature today when we review how education was like for these young children, and of course it's very much like any child who's not given the right learning tools. So they were treated as if there was something wrong with them, and of course the ripple effect of that. And I'm giving a very simplified sort of comments here, but it would have been they wouldn't have been given the correct education that they should have been given, and that would have obviously impacted them throughout their they're learning their life as a student, and when they join the labour force or further education.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
there's always been a strong reaction from parents about that, and there is a huge amount of, there was a huge amount that parents did, because black parents weren't willing to accept this, and they were very supportive of providing supplementary schooling for their children, because this was not provided by the state.
And do you think that this story, if you like, because to be honest, it is quite new to me to understand that level of detail. Is this well known, do you think, among the generation that didn't live through that?
I think, if you talk to local people, and of course some of these young people, they are much older parents or even grandparents now, and I think when we talk about ethnicity, culture, and race, I think what we found at the root of it is really we're talking about class, really, and it's that they were denied an education, which has had the biggest effect on their later life.
Sure.
And that's what's created these stereotypes of this negative, derogative image of that. And I think one of the other things is it's a strong sense of you must achieve. Teach. I think one of the things when we talked about, do we do something differently? And this is something that obviously every educator is, it's the first thing is having high expectations and high standards for your students, for your learners, and that's obviously reiterated by parents having that.
Yeah, fascinating. Is there anything that you think that is either needed now or potentially in the future to educate people more carefully about why some of the things have happened, or why some of the legacy that we've seen is how it is? Do you think that there's an education to be had by the wider community? I don't just mean in Brixton.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if we had a conversation with just a mixed bunch of young school children about, so this happened back in those days, and there's this idea about, and there's these stereotypes of this today. I think that the young children would be able to give us answers, and they'd be saying, it's because of this. That's why we've got this image today. And I'm talking about not children I teach, any young person, any young teenager.
Yeah.
Children are, they would be able to join the dots. And I think, it's the old thing again, the old chestnut of, unfortunately, our school history books need to be rewritten, and we should, young people are still introduced about medieval kings and queens, but
Yes.
why don't we need to go back and start with empire.
Sure. I would imagine that there would be a great sense of empathy from young people if they can put themselves in the shoes of that young girl who's come across and has this massive culture shock, and what does that feel like? It's like me saying to a young person here who's in their kind of comfort zone, and we're going to just go and drop you in the middle of China or in the middle of Africa. How would that feel to you? I think that's what strikes me more than anything with this.
And I think that's how young people have, we take for granted actually the sheer amount of empathy that young people do have. That when we frame it like that to them, when we say, imagine if tomorrow you were in school in China.
Yeah.
And they were like, wow, I hadn't, they would be able to, discuss very clearly about the simplest needs that would need to be addressed.
Sure, and how they feel. Do you find that many stories come back from them being successful, or where they've gone off to do other things in life, as using the school as a springboard, essentially?
Yeah, so there's, I think as young girls, we foster this idea of having a strong identity and high aspirations, and I think that's what determines like the philosophy and the core values of the school. So we've got, we follow a lot of this our girls as they go into womanhood, and they make incredible levels of progress, and a lot of them have got really successful stories to tell. So we've got many girls who go to the top 20 university. Oxbridge to do PPE.
Yeah.
And recently, we've just heard back from one of our old girls who,
Mm.
we call her an old girl, but she's in her early 20s, and she's just graduated as
Mm.
a doctor. And her story is very interesting in that when she was a young girl, it was a unpleasant incident which she'd seen in the surrounding area, a knife crime incident.
Mm-hmm.
And she'd gone to see what was happening, and obviously there was the commotion of the helicopter, ambulances had been there, and this was a key moment in her life. So she was from Peckham, and she just realised that she had a role, and there was something greater that she wanted to do, and the environment that she lived in.
Mm.
And now fast forward, and she's just entering her first year as a junior doctor. So I think there's so many incredible stories
Mm-mm.
of the and narratives of the girls that have come to us.
You are a British Council ambassador, and one thing that I found when I spoke to you before, really interesting, is that you did a project which explored the heritage of the school, background of the school, but also connected with other countries. And I'm kind of interested to know, this success that you're talking about with the legacy is in any way linked back to the approach of the school as an outward-facing environment for these young people.
Yeah, so I was really pleased to be when I joined my school, to be part of a really exciting project that had already started. So it was called the Garjam project, and that's the initial words were Ghana and Jamaica. So
Mm-mm.
many schools would be partaking in partnerships with another school, but our school was a triangle project. So it was
Sure.
3 points of the triangle: Ghana, Jamaica, and the United Kingdom.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that was to really recognise the slave, the trajectory of the slave journey,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
transatlantic slave route. So that came about in 2008 to
Mhm.
mark the bicentenary of the abolition of the Slave Act, and that really flourished. And I think when we think about as British Council projects, to lasted almost it lasted well into a decade, and we still
Yeah,
have the connections now.
yeah, yeah.
And what that brought for our schools, the schools in the other, in the other countries, and how really it was highly transformative, the
Mm.
experience.
Mm-mm. I think testament to any school that looks beyond its borders, if you like, to get influences or to find out more about their own heritage. I think that can apply to any school, but your school in particular has that fascinating story behind it. Can I just ask though, but on a more local level, because obviously there are other schools in the area. Um, I'll be honest with you, many children who are outside London really don't know what London's like. Many haven't been to London. In fact, one of my son's friends, who's 19, went down to London with him recently and to look at university accommodation, and had never been on the tube train, and said, "Oh, is this what a tube train looks like?" So, I think sometimes there's a perception that we can be in our little bubbles. So locally, just around your area, how does your school compare? Are there stark differences between the kind of the teaching and learning or the philosophy, or are they quite similar in not just demographic but in terms of the approach?
Well, St Martin in the Fields is unique in terms of its history.
Mm.
I think it's in the borough of Lambeth, and there's many schools which reflect the demographics of the area. But I think what is unique with my school is that we are also a Christian school,
Mm.
and we're in in the times that we live in. The religion and the faith, and I'm Muslim myself, and I work in a Church of England school, and I have done so for
Mm-hmm.
all my teaching career.
Mm-hmm.
That I've noticed that's the significant difference in terms of it's shaping an identity, a core value, and a way of life, and it's not
Sure,
just Christian. It's children of all faiths in our
sure,
school,
sure, sure,
and
sure.
I think that's the biggest difference.
Yeah, and do you find that's embraced by the children and the parents?
Yes, yes. So it's parents actively would decide to choose their girls to our school. So
Mm-hmm.
we had the Daughters of the Windrush, and that heritage of the Caribbean. But today we've got a lot. a lot of girls from West African heritage, and
Mm-hmm.
their homes are actively very much involved in church, and they want that continuation, so it's very much embraced.
Sure, sure. Actually, a lot of younger people still perceive that Brixton as an area is a potentially dangerous place to go. It has a particular demographic, maybe knife crime, this kind of thing. So I asked a few students around this area, which is a leafy kind of monocultural area. What do you think when I say, oh, Brixton, or school in Brixton? This perception that there's a little bit of a step back and this danger factor. But can you tell us a little bit about what the reality of Brixton is on a day-to-day basis?
So the Brixton of the 70s and
Mm,
80s
mm,
and even the early 90s is very different to the Brixton of 2020.
mm,
There is that history of riots and knife crime, but it's such a buzzing place today that I can only give the example of uh, it's an area, it's Lambeth, and it is an area of high economic deprivation.
mm.
And there are a high percentage of young people who are on free school meals, yet they can be in the local area. You could be standing at the bus stop next to a man who lives in a home that's over 1.5 million.
Right.
And I
Sure.
think there is that dichotomy and
Yeah.
contradiction that is the Brixton of today.
Mm, mm. So it's more of a melting pot, would you say now?
Yes, I mean, I think, yeah, it's a melting pot of diversity, all the food of cuisines of the world, you'll find, all of that diversity is
Mm,
there, but it is a very unique place because it has this diverse and rich history, yet today it's made, regeneration that's been
yeah.
pumped into that area.
Mm, mm.
I think it's an unfortunate fact that many young children of that area will never be able to afford. I mean, I won't. I cannot afford the housing prices of that
I'm sure
area.
you can on a teacher's wage, Obie, but no, I understand. I completely take your point. And actually, what I find really interesting, because I was starting to look inwardly and think, well, where do young people get these perceptions from? Because they weren't there, they weren't part of those riots. They weren't. Do you know what I mean? They weren't. They. How do they? And I can't help wondering how much parents of my generation will potentially feed that in almost subconsciously to the next generation who are outside. To think about your outward-facing approach with your British Council links and the way you explored a mutual project with another country, and look at how potentially we can do more of that locally. And actually, I was thinking that because it was your idea. You mentioned to me before about how schools more locally could just understand each other's areas better. So we talked about how different a school from Great Yarmouth might be, for example, or Norwich, or Bury St Edmunds, compared with a school in Brixton, and how you can bring that understanding together. Because do you want to explain what you were talking about?
Yeah, so I love the work with the British Council, and we twinned with the school in Reykjavik, and that was an incredible
Mm,
transformative experience with the children, and they still talk about it years later. Um, whenever I find myself in conferences with other educators around the UK, I'm always fascinated with their narrative. We're sitting at conference tables together, and they could be teaching in up in Newcastle, and I'm teaching in South London,
hmm.
and it's just so fascinating. And I just feel that we as educators have a role to present to the students the world that we live in, and we very much it's important about our global positioning, but within our country, it would be great to connect my children in South London
Mm.
with maybe a school in the countryside in Bristol,
Yeah,
and we'd
sure.
find, and I think
It'd be
when I think
fascinating,
about
actually, wouldn't it?
fascinating, or Great Yarmouth,
Yeah.
or Northumberland, because I think it just gives that misconceptions are broken down. But even before
Mm.
that, like on a basic level, like just the idea of geography, you know,
Yeah.
children are fascinated in looking at where they are on a Google map. You could probably even see the school on Google Earth.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so many things can happen. Amazing experiences can happen like that. ultimately also the children are really learning the same curriculum, the national curriculum, specific exam specifications, and there's so much more that's similar
Mm.
than divides and that is different. So I think
Yeah,
that would be an
yeah.
incredible partnership.
Sure, kind of sound bites in the media and this fast moving snapshots of the bad stuff, if you like, that come up with any area. But that can, as you said, potentially be broken down, and you get to the reality. And I think from the international work that I've done with China, Iraq, Rwanda, I always go with the perception. I try not to, but I always go with the perception, and then it's always blown away, and I always learn a whole bunch of stuff that is useful. So I think what this idea that we always have to go abroad to understand different cultures. There are huge cultural divides and differences between places, just even probably within London, I'm guessing. I mean, you're a London person through and through. How much is your understanding, perhaps, of some other areas of the country in terms of the schools themselves?
Well, I mean, in terms of the schools and in terms of being a Londoner, I mean, I've always been a proud South Londoner, and for me, I have this barrier of North London. This is a different territory. How
Sure.
my husband's from North London, and
Right.
that was probably be our biggest divide. Is that you're a North Londoner, I'm a South Londoner, and it's here, which is the best part of London,
Sure.
and the way we do things down here. So yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm South London, and we're talking about the boroughs of Lambeth, Croydon,
Mm.
even Wandsworth, Lewisham, and then obviously there are more. Even within those, there's pockets of the areas which were more affluent. You can be you can take a turn, walk 20 minutes down the road, and you just notice the way that the street is cleaner.
Mm. Mm.
There's
Mm.
those huge differences.
Sure.
Um,
Sure.
and I'm also on the faith committee in my school, and we connected with a school in North London, and I'd connected with the rabbi, and I just thought, how fascinating would that be on a faith level?
Mm.
To
Mm.
take girls from a Church of England school, and we can see how a school day works in a
Yeah.
Jewish school, and
Sure.
that's there's
Sure.
so much to learn from that experience.
Yeah, and actually, yeah, it reminded me of the local school here. A very good friend of mine is the head of sixth form and she took students from Little Leafy, Suffolk, to the mosque in London, and actually they were building up to it for days, kind of getting quite excited about it, and when they went down there, they're full of questions and what should I do? This kind of excitement. I think creating an excitement around learning about other cultures locally is probably a really interesting thing to explore. From a PE teacher's perspective, we would always go to other schools to play sports teams, but that's still a little bit of a bubble. And the most you'd see is, the change rooms and the fields and that, or the basketballs. But that actually genuinely often was a really good way of young people seeing that actually there's more in common sometimes than there are differences, and what differences there are can be embraced. I suppose finally, it's kind of how do we do that? This sort of call to action. How do we start linking schools together? And I suppose there is a place for visits, but potentially now we have such powerful video tools at our disposal. Do you see there's scope perhaps in the future to be looking at using video in some way to be creating this this link up between other schools and other areas?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think about when we connected with international schools, trying to get the timing right. But in UK schools, I mean, they pretty much roughly start at the same time,
Mm.
lunchtime's roughly at the same time, and so is end of the school day. So I think it's it's very much possible.
Sure.
And I think schools could find lots of ways of how they could do the link. So it could be, through their, citizenship, PSHE, well-being, or even, is it, am I thinking too ahead to think I could teach my English lesson to my year 10 class simultaneously, maybe also teaching a class in Belfast who are also doing English at the same time?
That's a really good
I
point.
think it is very doable.
Yeah, yeah. Share the expertise, of course, as well.
Yeah.
We're in a teacher recruitment kind of. I don't know whether it's still a crisis, but certainly has been a crisis. And this strikes me as though there's potential there to share expertise as well. I mean, you're obviously an experienced teacher. I'm sure other people could benefit from your expertise. So,
Well, I
yeah.
think we know that the pandemic has meant that things will never be the same, and there's so
Mm,
many more things that we're now doing that we'd never even considered as teachers, the way
mm.
we're using technology. So, this time last year, we probably never thought about teaching our young children from our kitchen tables. Is it too far advanced to think that we
Sure.
can teach our own class and
Mm.
teach another
Yeah,
class
yeah,
simultaneously through the
yeah.
means of technology?
Sure, sure. Well, I have to say, Obie, I'm excited by some of these ideas. It's been fascinating talking to you this morning. I believe that there's scope here in the future to be doing a lot more with this notion of sharing, using almost like a British Council model, but bringing it local. And so I just want to thank you because you got up early this morning to do this. I won't say what time, but it is early, and very much appreciate you being on board with this. So thank you.
No, thank you. It was great and pleasure.